Hi, Jarrell. How are you? We'll start in a couple minutes, okay? Go ahead and check out the lab. Good. Glad to know you're doing good. You're the only one that's here right now, so let's wait a minute or so for people to join us. Okay, so it's 5 o'clock. I'm going to go ahead and get started, and hopefully more people will be able to join us. So this week we are going to work on Fuzz, Burp Suite, and Python. The reason why I wanted to expand on Fuzz is because that's at the end of the chapter, and we didn't do so much assignments on it compared to the other tools. So, and also I wanted to introduce Burp Suite because the industry, most people are using Burp, so we wanted to kind of understand how it can be used. So as you take a look at your Lab 6, you should test these using your Linux VM, and you can also use it with your regular Windows system. It's just the installation for some of the things are going to be different, and you have to set up the system path. So to start, we'll talk about Fuzz and Burp. So FuzzDB is an application that we can use to do application security testing. It's common. And there are, there are variations of Fuzz. So you would see that there are different subdivision for this using this particular tool. But in general, you can use it to do injection patterns. So you can do SQL injection with it. You can also use it to traverse through a website or a web application and look for certain files or directories. You can use regex, which allows you to look for pattern. And commonly we would see that with JavaScript. So FuzzDB, you can integrate that with Python or JavaScript or another language like Java. So with FuzzDB, we would be able to create a attack pattern. And what that will be is just going to be a list of payload primitives that allows you to test with injection. And often that you would see this with SQL or cross-site scripting. So you can use that type of pattern to inject into a database. You can use that for directory listing, traverse through directory, especially when you're looking at a website. You can look at files, and we can brute force authentication, username and password, along with cross-site scripting and other areas. So here it talks about how it will be useful with attack pattern. And for information gathering, we can use it to populate some information to log files. And that's going to give us information about, locations, using dictionary or keywords or a word list to be able to identify different things like, files that contain certain word and lines and things like that. And that way you can also use it for brute forcing. So the link here provides you with the FuzzDB, and then you can pull that from GitHub, or you can clone it in your Linux VM. Now, the third part for the FuzzDB is to be able to contain regex pattern. And if you're not familiar with regex, you can use regex to be able to have a prediction of a certain pattern. You can search for certain things based on certain characters, string, and so on. And that is useful when attacker is looking for a certain information like your credit card, social security number, and more. So now in using this, you often see that Fuzz is used with another tool. And today we're going to look at Burp Suite. And Burp Suite gives you the graphical user interface, and you would use this for web applications. So if you want to understand more about the requirement, you can also search for, let's say, I think I mentioned this in my CIS27 in the past, but OWASP Foundation allows you to look for resources that will be for open web application security, tools, resources, some additional training, and so on. So this is widely used in the industry. You can look at the criteria on how to support the assessment for web application. If you go to the site, like what we've seen here, right, you get news and information. You can sign up and you can look at some of the resources. So they have events and things like that. So in the web application and the application security assessment, we often refer to the model that was created by OWASP and also the processes that will go in using OWASP. So a lot of these tools integrate the model. Now, coming back to the lab, here it talks about how Burp Suite is used for web application assessment. It consists of a group of tools that allows you to map, analyze, and look at your attack surface, especially for exploit the vulnerabilities in the application. And if you want to find out more information, you can visit this link, right? And it talks about configuration steps on. So Portswigger provides the documentation for this. And so when you are using Burp, you should always go back to their documentation. It talks about how to use their interface, how to look at things. And as you install the app, you would see that the tabs and things you need to configure in order for things to work. Okay. Now, Python script can be incorporated. And so today I'm attempting to give you a little bit of understanding on how to incorporate your script with Burp. And you can use that to be able to seek for things or to do brute force or to do various things for assessment. Now, the tutorial section on this website gives you the details on how to work with, various areas like looking at vulnerabilities, looking at how to really brute force the login, and so on. So they do walk you through all the steps. The professional version is going to require licensing. So today we're going to use the free version, which is very limited. But if you pursue this as a professional, you would acquire a license and be able to use that. So the step that I wrote down is to walk you through on how to use Fuzz with Burp Suite. Okay. So first, we are going to write the script, and I wanted to spend some time to look through the script so that way you would know what we're doing. Now, Burp Suite is written in Java, and in order for our Python code to work with Java, we have to have the library that's going to interpret, right, and convert that to what Java would understand. So in order to use your script, you have to integrate Jython or JPython, right, to be able to do the convert Python into Java. So at the top, you would see the import statement. So from Burp, we are going to import, right, the extender, and this is going to use the extender portion. So when we use the GUI, you're going to see why. Okay. Then it's going to generate payloads. So these two are going to be for intruder payload. and we would use those payloads for our attack surface. Then because things are written in Java, we have to use Java utility, and we want to use list and array list. So in Python, list or in Java, array list is different than list. It's very similar to Python list. You know, it is a container, but it is not rigid as an array. It is a dynamic array container. So that's why we would include the library for that here. And then here, that's going to be random for the random library. So the classes that you would see here is we're going to bring in those classes. That's from Burp. And we would have a function to do the callback. And for that, because when you do the payload, you want to be able to generate callback. So that way it will return some kind of value. So you would have those values to be reused for your attack. Now in our script here, we want to specify what that would be when it generates that, because it will happen in the back. So we just simply do a printout or return for that. And next is when we would use the parameters. So here is where you would create the instance, and then we would return that for Fuzz. So this is where Fuzz is going to come in. So here it talks about how we would initialize the Fuzz, okay? And that would use the fuzzer class, and that's how it's going to be able to do the fuzzing. That's what they call it. Then in the next part is going to be instantiating your members. So here is where we would have the extender and the helpers and the attack. Those are the components or the area of your memory that would be utilized to store values, especially when it deals with the payload, okay? And in this one, it's only going to generate one payload, but in reality, when you do this, you don't just generate one payload, you actually generate multiple payloads. So this is just a simple script to show you how it can be put together. And then for the next part is another method. And so it's gonna iterate through the payload. Since we're only gonna have one, it's only gonna go up to the one payload. Okay. Now for the rest of this is where we can take a payload and we can modify it, and we can generate something to inject into the website. So this part right here, basically what it does is it's gonna create the elements for the payload. And then as you do that, you can put in the string hello, right? And it's supposed to change it to, there's a typo here, to world. So this function, when it's called, if the user type in hello, right, it's gonna take that hello, modify it into a world, okay? So here, this is why this statement is created, and we can do it manually so you can see what that would be. And then when you inject your script, that's the functionality of it. And then it would then reset. So because we're using an API, right, we want to have a function so that way it would reset the API. Now, to download Burp, you would visit this link, and it's going to take you here. Okay, you have to enter your email in order to download. So you can use something that you would use to download software. The product that we're going to be using is the Community Edition, which is free. And again, it's going to be limited. So some functionality that you see in professional and enterprises are not integrated at this. And sometimes they're grayed out, but additional features that you would see on the professional and the enterprise edition are better, right? As they cost. So what I want to introduce to use the free version so you are familiar with the interface, and then later on, if you come across Burp again, or if you want to pay for the license, you'll be able to use it. So once you download it, you can install it. and just simply run the exe, right? Okay. Now, sorry, this one. So because I'm using Windows, right, as an OS, it's going to give me the Windows version. So once I download that, I just simply launch the installer and then it's going to go through. So here it walks you through that. You're going to accept the license agreement. And once you have it installed, it's going to look something like this. Okay. And in the community edition, you don't have the option to select these compared to the professional and the enterprise. So in our free edition, we can only start a temporary project. It cannot be really saved. So every time that you test it, you just use it as a temporary project. In the other edition, you're able to save from this and retrieve an existing project. So that's one of the main area that's different as well. So once you have it installed and open, okay, it's going to look like this. And you are going to select or keep the default selection temporary project. And then you're going to go next. Now, if you create the configuration file, and there are many resources where you can make a config file, and you can load that here. Simply browse to it. And then you can also set it where you want a default for the future, or you can disable extensions. So today we are going to use extensions, which is our script and also our Java, our jar file. So we don't want to disable the extension. So we would just use the Burp defaults. So here I put down that you are going to use the Burp defaults, and then you simply click start. And it's going to take about a minute to go, right? So as you can see that I've scanned previously on some of the website that I could scan. So that's what your result would be. And so on the pro version, it's also going to allow you to filter and put in the category. So that way you can generate that for your reports. Now at the top, you would see that it has all of these tabs, and these tabs are used for configuration purposes. Okay. So with that, once we start the Burp, we are going to also download Jython, which is for Java. So when you click this link, you will be able to download Jython, which is the extender that you need in order for it to talk to the application, because it's written in Java. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay, so I put down the explanation here, and this extension is really going to reference how we're going to use the API. And that's also written in Java, so that's why we have this. Okay. Now, in order to incorporate the extension, once you download it, you need to click on the extender tab. So here is what you would see, and at the top, you would see the extender tab here. So the way that it works simply, if you're just looking at the dashboard before we talked about extender, is you can use it as a scanner, and we would scan it against a certain domain. So let's say if we want to scan it against google.com, we would, put in the information about that domain, configure, right? You can configure your target, which is that domain. You can also look at your proxy, and you can set this up, but at the same time, you can write the script to be able to perform the same thing. So the next step is to click on the extender. And what we want is we want to be able to add our script that we write in Python, and you can name your script anything you want. Okay. Now, if you want to remove the script, you simply click remove, or you can set the priority of your script, because sometimes we can run one script after the other, right? So you can add in multiple scripts here. Okay. So after we click the extender tab, under the extender tab, you would see these sub-tab, which allows you to set your extensions, right? And then here, this is what the details for, you know, some of the sub areas in how you want to search for things, and then your API, but we are going to use the options. So under options, this is where we would need to select our jar file. Okay, and I try to screen capture that. And even when you go through the tutorial that they provide, they also give you how to install and how to set it up. Now, these two options are selected by default. So the area that I want to configure is the Python environment, because my script is in Python. But if you write your script in Java, this is where you would be able to set up your files. Okay. And then it also works with Ruby. Okay. So you need to make sure that you have the jar file there. Now, we simply downloaded that earlier. So you just use select and then find the download that you have. So I got that from my downloads folder. And if you have specific custom module, you would need to set that up here. Okay. So that's the two things that I want you to take away from this is when you're running an extension, which is a script that with this application, which uses API, make sure that your script is in the extension area. Okay. And make sure that your jar file, which is for Java environment, is in the option area. Okay. So this is a way that we can link, right, the files so that way it will work across the two languages, and then we can actually execute this. Okay. Any question? All right. So after we set that up, right, I mentioned that you would go to the extension on the top left, and then you simply are going to click add. And here you would choose Python, and then you would select your file. So here I just need to go to my file, which is, oh, I'm in download. So hold on 1 second. See. Then I just need to put in my script. Okay, and you can name it anything you want. So I have it under L6 Burp Fuzz. And then I just click open. Now, if you want to output to a specific file, like a log file or a text file, right, you must create that, or you can tell it to output to console or show in the UI. So these, by default, it's going to try to show in the UI if you don't have any file. But if you do have a certain file that you want to save for your reporting purposes, so for pen testing and then, right, we always want to report out at the end, and that's what our purpose is, right? To find the issues and then document it. And so we would be able to select the file here. At this point, we're going to do the UI, and so that the output is going to be here. So if the case that you run into errors, right, you would look at the errors tab and see. Okay. And then we can close. So now I have 2 because I added it. So you can always remove 1. All right. Any question? Okay. So once we have that set up, okay, once we add our Python file script, then on Burp GUI, we are going to click on proxy. And on the proxy, as you understand, proxy is just other systems that will be used to pass traffic or filter traffic or control traffic. You can implement ACL and proxy. You can make it where it would be able to pass traffic quickly or add additional proxy to it, or you can use it to filter. Now, by default, your interception is off. So what we want is we want to be able to intercept the traffic that's going to that domain and to see if it is vulnerable. If it is, right, then likely that you would have to fix some of the issues with that particular web server or that DNS server. Okay. Now, the below tab here, it gives you various options to set it up. You know, you can look at WebSocket history. We talked about socket when we program it. And then the get and the post stuff is going to show up on the HTTP history and so on. So using the browser, it has a browser functionality built in, which is Chromium. Okay, so we are going to click intercept on. So when you click intercept off, it's going to activate it. It's going to turn it on. And that's how you're going to be able to scan. So here is where I turn on my intercept option. Then I'm going to open up the browser within the app. This. And by default, it's going to use your loopback address. Why is it showing me that? Okay. Sometimes it generates some funky error. So here is my browser, right? And then what I want to do is I wanted to put in the domain. So I wanted to use test PHP. This is a website that you would use to test various sites. And in the case where if I have multiple like this, sometimes, you know, if you have many, it's not going to like it. So it's going to try to tell you like close one. So here we would see that we're intercepting, that's on. And then we generate the request to this domain and we're using port 80. This is its public IP. Okay. So when we connect to the site, we would see that it will be get HTTP. We talked about that a few weeks back. This is your host information. Okay. And then it tells you about the user agent, which are your common browser. And, you know, the encoding, it does accept gzip and the language and so on. Okay. Now, if you want to forward or drop the traffic, you can select these. Under the action, you can set up things. So for example, I can send this into the intruder. We can configure the intruder tab. We can also have the decoder at work. So these are all the functionality on how we would be able to generate attack or scan for things. So this can be used as a, you know, a vulnerability assessment type of tool, or it can be used as an attack tool. So you can set up various things here by clicking the action. So what I had put down was to, after the proxy, you are going to click the intruder tab and you're going to click payloads. And so what you would see is like in our script, we create the payload. There's only one payload that we create, but on the interface itself, you would see that you can set up a certain type of payload for it to go. Okay. So intruder tab, and then, oh, I forgot to set the action. So sorry. We're going to send that to the intruder, which is that. And then we're going to go to the intruder tab. Okay, now it works. So you have to set up that it sends to the intruder so the other tab would have the information. So here it lists the payload position, which is your domain. Okay. And this was the result from when we use the browser to visit that site. Okay. Let me read. So it's still trying to connect. Sometimes it's a little slow. Now on the attack type, you would see that there are some options. So if you look at it closely, it's going to tell you you have sniper option, you have battering ram, where it would use only one single set of payloads, not just one payload, but a group of payloads. And it would iterate through and it's going to place the payload into the position all at once. Okay. And then there are other options like pitchfork and cluster bomb. So this is a way that we can generate different type of attack, and through the application we can do that. Okay. So by default, it's going to select sniper for you. Okay. So now we're going to click on the payloads tab. And this is where you would be able to set up your payload. So on the application itself, without the script, right, we would be able to generate. So by default right here, right, you would do a simple one payload set, okay, which is what you've seen in the script. You can also modify this. So if you want to brute force, of course, brute force is not going to generate one set. So you can specify by just click an option on that drop-down menu. Okay, so we're going to keep the default here. And in your list, what you can do is you can simplify what your strings would be for the payload. Okay, so for the payload options, we are going to put in the world or whatever that you like for your string to be. So what it will do is when the user input, let's say hello as a string, it's going to intercept that and modify that as another string. Okay, so it's going to act as a middleman, and when it gets to the system, the server, right, it's going to update the packets, and it's going to generate that with a different string. So when you want to add any kind of string, you would put that here, and you can add various. So sometimes you can also create a list that will be external, and you can bring that in. And then below that, it just allows you to set up different type of processing. Okay, so you want to configure this before you launch the attack. Any question? So once that happened, let's see. It did not like that. Got it working yesterday. So let's see if I add the rules. Let's do match and replace. See if this works. So I added the processing to change. Let me see if I put down any additional step. Okay. Yeah, it was working yesterday. Let me see. You can define from one-on-one payload. Let me see if it will take the brute forcer real quick. How does a string? How is a string a payload in the attack? So when you put in a string into the field, what that does, it uses a regex. So when you visit the site, okay, it's not loading for me here, but I'm gonna use the regular browser so you can see. So when you visit the site, if the user inputs something like this, right, and click go, it's supposed to generate that, right? And then, oh, I see why. Okay. Yeah, their database is down. So that's why it's not loading. So when you input anything in the field, like a string, it's supposed to take that string and then modify it to whatever you tell it to do, okay? And it simply use a regex. So when it issued this packet is going to be sent with this data. And so what it will do is going to take that and then modify the data inside the packet and then generate it as it intercepts it and then generate it as a different string. Yeah, so I'm not able to get through because the site is down. But anyway, it's so lovely when things work when you test it and then things don't work when you get to class, right? It goes out the window. But so the point is, okay, when you generate this, okay, you can set it up on how you want it to process the payload, right? It's going to use, because remember, it's going to look for, it's a way that we can identify patterns. We can look for certain keywords. We can even generate, you know, a brute force, as you can see, okay? And in the position tab, it tells you here that you can define more in how you want it to position. Now, let's pause there real quick and coming back here. So right here is where if it's connecting and it's sending your request, it would update the type of vulnerability in as a report for you. So the payload is never one word. It is a string and may bypass exception handling, for example. Okay, yeah, so it doesn't have to be just one word. It is a string that may bypass exception handling. Yes. So when you do injection, you don't necessarily just use one word. And that's just what we use as an example, right? Hello world. But normally you would have a group of characters, and you can also use a list of characters that you can get from, like, you know, different repository from Fuzz to be able to do that. Other comment or questions? Okay. So as you look at this, right, what you're doing, what I'm trying to show you is on the interface, right? When we set up the simple list through the intruder, right? We send it to the intruder and we can set up, you know, your payload option. Similarly, what you would see is in your script, when you run that script as an extension, right? See how this section is? So when you do a match and change for your payload, right? So in the processing part, if you do a match and replace, that's exactly that, okay? So if you add, you can set up the rules on how, you know, certain string, reverse substring, and so on. And this is really built for other form of attack instead of just replacing, right? But the way that we look at it today is like an injection. So it's going to take what is original, right, and replace it. So you're going to inject in a new string. And so that way it's going to forward that to the destination, which is your server. Okay. And then you do have options, and if, you know, when you're working with things that are encrypted, so you have like hash, you can also work with different encoding, because web applications sometimes would not use your general UTF-8. So, you know, if it uses like R, for example, we saw that it's using it's using various. So here it allows you to select the options for the decoding as what the site would be encode. So if it's HTML, binary, octal, gzip, and so we know that the site that we attempted uses gzip when we first scan it. So that's what you would use for the decoder. Okay. Then so you can also do live capture with sequencer and other options here, but I gave you the link. So in the case where if you need to explore more on Burp, because understanding this tool is going to be very handy. I highly recommend knowing how to utilize this and be, versed with this, because if you add that to your resume, it does have very much a value to your career. Okay, because right now this is the hot stuff for the industry. It's been around for a bit, but so if we're using the free version, they're gonna give you, much of what you would see, but in the paid version, you have a little bit more feature. Okay. All right. Let me see if I can reopen the browser here. It's gonna let me. Yeah, so when it says this, that I have something that's already open. Let me see if I can. Sometimes it takes a little bit because it has to scan and. Okay. All right. So for the first part, okay, once you have it set up, and even if it's, if the site is down and it's not accepting your injection, just you can just still provide the screenshot. It does take a little few try to go. I think I did like 7 yesterday before it actually, gets connected, but also because that website is very common, a lot of developers use that to test. So you would see that it might be down, or it generates some kind of error. So it catches the exception there. And then looking at your code, right? Explain to me what is the purpose of your Python script. It's exactly what we have been doing, is to set up a simple list of one group of payloads, and we simply replacing, match and replace string in our script. Any question? So side note, before we go into the next one, I wrote a lab for my CIS27 that was done today with Tor. So as we expanded on Tor last week, right, I will add a document to last week materials if you're interested in, using the browser and things like that. So I actually have them set up the browser successfully and then link it in Kali and so on, right? And then I also use other things in Kali. So I'll share that document with you if you're interested in using Tor, and then some of, redirecting some of the traffic to Tor. All right, any question regarding part A? Okay. And if you have LinkedIn Learning, there are a few tutorial videos that was originally created with lynda.com that's on, Burp and Fuzz. And keep in mind that, these tools get updated. So sometimes if the videos were created like maybe a year back, some of the features might look a little different, but ultimately the purpose is still the same. So if you need access to LinkedIn Learning, just send me a message and I'll add you to the user group. And that way you can have access to it. I think most of you have it, but if you don't, we can add you. Okay. And then on LinkedIn Learning, once you access it using your RCCD account, You can search for it there. You know, they do a good job explaining it on lynda.com. So a lot of the resources, when you do look at like, you know, FuzzDB and stuff like that, some of the stuff that's out there, if it's out there, it, you know, it's not that abundant, but if it's out there, you really have to test it, because a lot of the things that they posted is actually for Python 2, not for Python 3. So some of the things will not work in Python 3. Okay, so we'll talk about WFuzz, and this is just another framework and, you know, using Fuzz. This is a way that we can automate security assessment for web application. Almost all our applications are web-based, very few that you see nowadays that's going to be running just on the native system. We use web application because we want to be able to maintain it and make it accessible to all the user, and then it can be easily implemented and deployed through the cloud. So this is a framework for us to look at the vulnerabilities of our web applications, and through that we would be able to exploit, to test it, or, you know, to look at the areas of exploitation so we can protect it. It is a good tool to scan, and you know, it is a framework where you can, it's modular, so there's subcomponents that you don't have to really use. It's implemented with Python and the latest version of Python. It works with request and response. So, and we touched on that in the past. So what you would see is you would see the application being available to us, and we can use WFuzz to test it before we roll it out. Okay. I highly recommend that you take a look at the documentation before you use it. Just all the open source tool is this way, right? So if you visit their repository, you will be able to, if you clone the Git repository, you would get some of the text file that is used for like brute forcing and so on. And you can also find websites and links of our other developer that they create their own lists and things, so you can pull those. So this allows you to fuzz. So when people say fuzzing, a lot of times it's clumping into one area. But if you look at fuzz, there are different areas that you can get into. So right now, like the two things that we're looking at is mostly for web applications and website. And that will be for security assessment. So in pen testing, a lot of people do really well, right? The general population would focus a lot on like network intrusion, and, you know, a lot of it is just network based and system based. The areas that you should expand on, and it's really, you know, more of a less common area, is the web application, and that requires understanding programming, working with scripts and the languages. So it's highly demanded, because a lot of, you know, a lot of people, they might be pen tester, but they might not be able to do this part. And so if you can do this part, right, and you understand, you know, all the tools and the components that work with it, and understand how to work with OS, right, you would be successful in the field. Okay, so it does have a command line interface for the fuzz. Okay, and the so these are some of the example on how to do it. And then if you click the second link that I provide you here, so if you're running Mac OS, you need to take a look at their installation instruction. Okay. So just like any of the Python tools or framework, you would be able to use pip. And so, but let me pull up my machine real quick. And while that's started, we'll take a look at, let me close this. Okay, so let's get, so you can use Ubuntu or Kali if you have Kali. Now, WFuzz, it already exists in the web, I think it's called web assessment menu. So if you're using Kali, you don't have to install it. Sorry, I have a typo here. Okay. Now, since I'm using Ubuntu, I have to install it. So if you're using other Linux releases, you need to first update it, and then you need to install WFuzz. Once you have it installed, you just need to access its directory. So if you in Kali, right, you don't have to do these two parts. It's 26 and 27. You simply just go to the directory itself. So you would get to the WFuzz directory. Then after that, you are gonna look at the help options. So in the case where if you need additional, resources on the options that you want to use. Now, if you're using a certain file, make sure the file exists in its directory. Because if you use a WFuzz command and if the file is not there, of course, it's gonna throw an error. If your file is placed in another area, you have to make sure that you include the path, okay? Otherwise, it does not work. So WFuzz work directly in command line, so that's why they call it CLI, right? So the way that you interface with it is directly through the terminal in Linux. And your buzzword is always going to be fuzz at the end if you want to do fuzz. Okay, even though so the application is WFuzz, but if you want to fuzz at the end, you have to do the /fuzz. Okay. And this, like what you've seen in Burp, it also generates payload, and you can use it for various reasons, starting with brute force. Okay, so let me log in. Any question while we get set up? Okay. So once you're in your VM or your Linux machine, if you have your Linux machine at home, right, just open up terminal. And then what you would do is you can do the update and then install. So I think I have it already. So, but and that will take a few minutes for it to update everything. And then after you install, the next time you use it, you should also update it again. Okay. So as it updates here, after we update, we're going to install the WFuzz. And then we will change it to the directory. So for step 30, what it's doing here is you're using a word list, which is a file that already exists with the installation of WFuzz. So this is going to give you, right, the word list that will be as a payload, and it's going to hide the 404 message. So when you do the HC here, it's going to hide the 404, and 404 is just like an error status code, right? And then simply your endpoint URL is going to be whatever that would be following that. And you want it to finish it up with the /fuzz. Okay. Now, as you look at their documentation, pay attention to some of the example. Remember that when they document, they have used a previous version of Python, and the library has changed since then for WFuzz. So some stuff, right? And if it's throwing an error, you just gotta logically think back like, oh, did I put the file there? Is there a file that's in that certain directory? So right now you should be under the WFuzz directory. Okay, so sure why. Okay. Then we're going to change the directory. So we're inside that now. Then we would use the WFuzz with the help option. So here it shows you how you can use that command in CLI. Okay, what kind of options that you would have. So W stands for web, and it is a web fuzzer. Okay. And it talks about that here, and then you can use like various options to do whatever you need. Okay, so we'll try out a few things. Let me double check my, okay, I do have a copy and paste option. So just a note, if you don't know, right, if you're using your virtual machine and if you want to copy and paste between your host OS and your guest OS on VirtualBox, once your virtual machine is already running, if you click devices and then you go share clipboard, if you click bidirectional, it allows you to copy and paste from the outside, which is your host system, to the inside, which is your guest OS. Okay. So let's see. I'm going to copy this. So we are going to generate, right? We're going to use the file, which is the word list. And then it's also, it has a comment.txt file. It's going to hide the 404. It's going to generate, right, a certain number of requests. It's going to fuzz this domain. Okay. So here you are going to get a table. It's going to give you the ID. And we are filtering using this command. We're filtering some of the information that's given to us. Okay, so we would have a 301, and this shows you the number of lines. This shows you the number of words. This shows you the number of characters, right? And the payload is the admin. So we found some stuff there. And then continuingly, you have additional information here. So altogether, that took us about 10 seconds, or a little bit under 10 seconds. It processed 949 49 requests, and it filtered, right? And then per request is this. Okay. Any question? Okay. So when you look at that, make sure that you answer the questions based on your output. Take a screen capture. Now we are going to write a Python script, very small one at least. You can do it directly in shell line by line, but I can make a little script in my virtual machine and I can run it. Okay. So W range. Okay, so what we can do is we can create this script. And let's take a look at that script real quick. So we're using WFuzz. So we import that in. We're iterating, right, through a range of 0 through 99 payloads. Okay. And then the endpoint URL, again, is our test PHP vulnerable website. and we're using the fuzz command. So we're fuzzing that, and then we want to print out the details for the payload. So then we're gonna go ahead and Control X, yes to save, enter to save the same name. Then we can do a Python 3 WFuzz range.py. So unlike the last one, you're not going to get the nice little table. It's only going to give you the raw content from what it got for as it loops through. So you're still going to have the ID information on the left. This is your status code. So that means it connects fine, right? And then your line, your words, your character. And these are just your value for each of them. And as you can see that they are not sequential as the way that, you know, how it generates the payload. It doesn't have to go from 0 through whatever, but it does jump back and forth. But if you do count it up, it's actually 100, 0 through 99. So with that, right, you see your ID, your response, your line, your words, your character, and your payloads information. You can take a screen capture. Now, there are other ways that we can do the range and we can filter out our payload. So what if I only want to look at a certain type of payload? Okay. Oops, sorry. Let me find. Okay. So what we can do is we can use the command, right? We can use the WFuzz command, and what we can still range and we can filter some of the details. Gotta check the whole thing. And just like how you would see that in the last one, right? You would want to also include your URL with the fuzz keyword, and then you want to set up your filter option. So now what we can do is we're looking at your ID for your payload, the status code for the response, right? The number of lines, your words, your characters. And on this one, we're only going to do a range between 0 to 10. And so it also gives you the process time as they wrote that into the module or the package actually. And it processed 11 because it's 0 through 10. Okay. And it didn't filter anything. We set it up so it's only 46 seconds. So this is less than what you've seen in the other one. So I want to show you how you can do range in command or in script. To that target, right? Okay. Now, if we need to work with encoders, we can use the CLI directly to do that. And as you take a look at this, right? Can I take this and put it into the script? Yes, very similar to what you've seen here. And if you read the documentation, they talk about some of the methods that's integrated in the subclass. So you can definitely write additional script for. So all of these commands at the programming level, you know that it's just functions and component of your program. So when you run the command in CLI, right, you would see that it also works at the programming level as well. Okay, so the next part, we are going to use encoder, and this one, instead of using only one type, we're going to use MD5 and SHA. So for the encoders, we are going to use that within the payload. So you would do a WFuzz and you would list, right? That's your target. And again, we are going to do a fuzz. Now, if the site doesn't respond because it's protected, then we know that it's not vulnerable or susceptible to scans and, you know, these form of attacks. So, okay. So this is a little different than what you've seen in the last one. Okay, you still fuzz against the, well, this one is a different website, but you can use the same destination. But what that is it's going to give you both SHA and MD5. So here it tells you more on the detail with the payload. And again, it's going to give you the response. So if we want to filter out certain response or include certain response, we can definitely set that up in our command. Okay, and if you don't know how to use WFuzz, you would do the first one that we did, which is WFuzz/help, or the option help-help, which is H, and that's going to give you some of the general options. Or look at the documentation. Okay, so that with the MD5 and the SHA, it processed 9 requests. Okay, and then you can use different encoder as certain sites would use various encoder. So on the Burp suite that you saw earlier, right, like there's a drop-down option where you can select your encoder and the decoder. So it has similar functionality. It just has a graphical user interface, and some of the options that you would configure is a little different. But ultimately, when you scan for web applications, you would see that, you know, we normally examine a lot of the times payloads, header, response, and, you know, see how it's responding to certain requests. And that can determine the level of vulnerability for that website or that web application. Okay. So answer the questions once you have that output. So we can also chain it using the @ symbol. So this is going to be, we're going to do something similar to what we've done here, but this is only going to be for SHA-1. And then we are going to use the @ symbol none. This is going to specify that the payload is only using SHA encoder, and the result will be encoded again using none encoder. Okay, so that's how you can chain it. So let me hit copy on this so I don't take too long to type while you wait for me. Okay, so for this result, because we're looking at SHA and then encoding with none encoding, then we have less requests. So we would be at 6. Okay. Any question? So now common that you would see a lot of the websites support like Java plugins, different type of plugins for elements of that website to work, like Flash. Flash is dated and it's not very secure. So many companies, they move away from plugins because issues, right? You know, prone to, you know, injection attacks and different things. And then, or they would embed malware with the plugin. So when the user visits the sites and they have to install the plugins, it will introduce malware to the consumer or the user. So a way that we can test it is to look at plugins. Okay. So for 38, it talks about web application vulnerability scanner. to scan against plugins, and with Fuzz, WFuzz, you can do that. WebFuzz, you can do a WebFuzz -e script. So we would see that it analyzed, and I pulled this from their website. So this is why you see it should be like this. Your passive script is gonna look at your request and response, okay, without generating any additional requests. If you're doing an active scan, you are going to perform a new request. Now, I mentioned this to all the security students when they start scanning, is that there are scanners that are invasive and there are scanner that's non-invasive. So when we're passively scanning something, we're just looking at existing response and requests that's happening for that web server. But if you're doing an active scan, you have to generate a new request, which when you generate a new request, it establishes a socket, which is an abstraction layer for your connection, which includes your IP and your port. So it calls home. It goes back to your system unless you cover your track, right? So in the case where if they want to be more anonymized in the way that they scan, right? Without the passive, they have to really spoof, okay? So, or use some form of encrypted traffic passing mechanism. So what you would see is that when we look at this, we have to think about how we're scanning, what we're scanning, and whether it's gonna come back. It has to come back to you so you can see, okay? So some of the category you can use discovery. This allows you to automatically queue or in-queue the content using the tool. So what it does is it creates a pool, a group of the requests, and it would generate that. It would automatically automate some of the process for you. So the discovery categories will allow you to do that. And then the default is going to be for your group plugins. And in the following sections, you can select different type of plugins. And I mentioned that, like Java is one of them. Lots of websites still use Java. Like if you ever use Practice Labs use Java. Depending on the version, right? The version can also imply vulnerability. So if they're using a certain version that has flaws, then that will be vulnerable. Okay, so let's do WFuzz -e scripts. Okay, so here, this is why I include the categories for you to see, because when it outputs it, it gives you the category. Okay, so it tells me here that this is passive, the headers, it looks at the server headers. Then you have default active discovery, and for new content, this is for the robots, okay? And that's parsed as robot.txt. So why is that used? It's used on sites to gather information from the consumer, pulling stuff for the cookies, a way to advertise things to the consumer. So you would see some plugin element that would be for specific purpose that they integrate on the web application or the websites. Like if you ever play a game and you see a little banner at the bottom, and it's always going to advertise to what you were using on your browser. Like if I was looking for shoes, all of a sudden when I'm playing a game, I see some kind of shoes advertisement on the bottom. So what they do is they use the plugin, right, to really pull your trend from your cookies or history or whatever. And so it has some component in that. Okay, so here when you scan, you would see the category, right, the type of scan for the scripts, and then the type of scripts that you're working with. Okay, all right, then any question? Okay, so now we are going to look at the default. So here it tells you that we can obtain the detailed information for the default and using this. And again, I'm only giving you some subset of this. So if you want further information, you can also go to their resource, and then, you know, there are also a lot of tutorial videos. Well, I wouldn't say a lot. There's some, because fuzz tools, depending on the type of fuzz tool, some are more popular than other, and sometimes people don't put up all the videos or they don't know how to use it. So, all right. So as earlier we saw that there was robot. So here you have that, right? It parses the .text file. Okay. And then additionally, you have additional, like the sitemap, we saw that extractor. You know, some of these are, so the type of file format and so on. So this is a database. .db, let's see what else. Some CBS entries file. So that will be pertaining to Windows. Here you would see directory listing. So for the default passive, it's going to look for that. So simply what we're fuzzing here is we're just going to try to look for vulnerability there. Okay. And this one is under the default. That would run as default scripts. So you see that like the robot does it. Some of the other ones are set up to do that there. But when we scan with the other ones, it lists everything. This one is only in a category. So if you want a certain category, you can tie that into the command there. And then we're almost done. So for the next part, for 40, we don't want to rescan for a lot of things, right? We want to have options in how we would look at the things that are scanned already, it's placed into cache. So we can disable, you know, or use cache. It all depends on what you want. So here it talks about how cache can be disabled when you're using the no cache flag. And so when you scan, you want new information because you already got what you previously did, right? So what you can do is you can use this, okay, in the whole entire thing, because we've got to have the endpoint URL. And that is going to give you the non-cache. So now what you would have is you would have additional detail. You have the server information. Again, it's I'm going to give you the the line, the word, the characters, the response, which is the status here shows 200. It did catch. So if they block the SQL stuff, it's going to come back like this. Okay. Because if they have like entry field where you can add in, so it's going to attempt to send that, and it's you're going to see this. And then the elapsed time, so it's always going to give you, cool thing about WFuzz is always going to give you like how long it take to do it. You can see how responsive that server is based on the elapsed time there, or the total time, the process time. Okay. And then if we want to disable the cache, we would do the same thing, but we actually modify, right? So you would see up to here, and then at the end, you just add the no cache option. Okay. So when you're comparing a cache with no cache, right? This one, it took me 24.57 seconds. And then the other one, the cache, is 23.7. So you shave about, at most, like it depends on the time that you run this. Sometimes you would get like maybe 10 seconds difference. In this case, it's only like a few seconds, right? We see that it's maybe like 3 seconds at the most, close to 3 seconds. Okay, so for the no cache, it does take a little longer compared to the cache. So is the result the same as the previous step? It should be, right? You still have the error identifier for the SQL. The way that it's displayed is that it's gonna actually look at each of the ID. But if you compare the information, you still have the server information, you still have the lines, the word, the character sizes, the payload ID. Okay, what it does is just gonna, it's formatting a little bit different, but overall you get the same information. It does take a little longer, right? If you compare the time. So that takes care of 41. And then for 42, we are going to do the robot script. And in this one, what we're going to do is we are going to create what's called a recipe. And what that recipe does is it can be saved. So you can, use it for that same web application later on to test, or, be able to automate that and distribute it to similar, or subdomain or whatever. So we would then use this. Okay, and it tells you that it is stored in TMP, directory, and recipe. So that's how you can create the recipe. Any question? So I hope that I can give you a little taste. I know some of you probably have tried Fuzz in different forms, or maybe you've used WFuzz. I encourage you to, expand your skill in this. And as you do, for every skill that you comfortable doing or knowing well, you need to add that to your resume. Like, keywords like this. The people who really know this stuff, right? Like when they look at it, they look at the, so you can say security assessment, or you can say web application assessment. You can start listing some of the tools on your resume, and that catches people's eyes, because most of the time the managers, the technical managers, they look at that and that's what they're going to look for, the type of tools, the version of the tools, the type of the tools that you use. If you use Burp Suite, you can say which version, and if you want to include a little bit of details on what you're able to do. So, and I didn't want to really reiterate some things we've done in the assignments, because we did script in the assignments quite a bit using the textbook information. If you look at the textbook, they did do, SQL injection and brute force. You have the link on how to get the source code for that. You can use it, and you can use some of these vulnerable websites to test, your code, of course, or your script. So I wanted to take this opportunity to introduce you to the industry relevant tools, and you can use it. And you can also, you should continue to practice it. And then as you use your command, you can think about how you would be able to write your Python script. And if you already have your script, you don't have to retype the command. You just run that script that has all the functions that you need to be able to execute it. But yeah, there are some resources available online. Some of these are not abundantly available. So, you might have to refer to textbook. A few textbook talks about this. I know that the pen, but like cookbook, the pen test cookbook, sometimes they'll go over a couple of things. But even with that, like, I tested some of the scripts that the books provide, not our book, but other books provide. Yeah, they're kind of junky too. So, you know, you have to really think about like, you know, libraries get updated, things, tools change. So in our field, it's not one of those things that, you know, you can create something and you'll be done with, right? You always have to update it and maintain it and be able to learn new tools because different things are born, you know, all the time and it changes all the time. So this is a field that keeps you updated all the time. You have to keep retrain or train yourself on new tools, which is good because, you know, it keeps your mind pretty fresh and, you know, as you proceed. Okay. Any question? All right. So I'm going to go ahead and stop recording and I always forget.